Hello and welcome to another episode of Winning in Professional Services. I'm Scott Pressmone and I'm joined by my co-host Matteo Travato. So the question for today is, are webinars dead? Is there still a place for webinars in the marketing of a smaller mid-sized business, specifically professional services business? And I think this is an important topic because I recall a few years ago, right, when we were going through the whole COVID pandemic stuff, is that everyone was getting a Zoom account and there were a ton of webinars going on. Everyone realized they needed to host their events online. And so just about every day I got an invite for a webinar. And I think that that was, for me at least, an overload period where, you know, if a new invite is coming in for a webinar every day, you are, after a while you say, I just don't even want to see another invite to another webinar. And I think it can kind of turn people off for a while. But I personally still believe that webinars are still really effective, and I think that they can be used. And even if there's a lull in the amount of people that are hosting webinars now, I find them incredibly valuable. And I think that there is a place to get ahead of myself a little bit on this podcast topic. I think that it is a really important thing for small businesses to host webinars. So, Matteo, I want to get your thoughts on whether or not you think webinars are important. And I also want to ask you, when was the last time that you personally attended a webinar?
Yeah, I definitely think webinars are still important today, even for professional service companies that operate at a local or regional level. I still think having this type of live events could be worth a worthy sort of effort to start to get visibility with your target audience and generally to demonstrate your expertise. We know that in professional services, what we're really selling is expertise, and so being able to build trust and cover topics that we know our target audience would be interested in learning more about, specifically to our services, is, I think, a very worthy investment of resources, in my opinion. And I do attend webinars pretty regularly, even to this day. I just attended a webinar last week. Luckily, the company that was hosting that webinar, rescheduled it for the people that couldn't attend the week prior. So it was really something I wanted to attend, and luckily I was able to get on the second live event and even get at that point a recording of the whole event again, so I can rewatch it if I even want to rewatch it on a little bit on my own terms. But again, I think if the topics covered during the webinar are valuable to you as a potential customer of them, or even just not necessarily becoming a customer later on, but just something that actually provides value that you cannot get anywhere else. You cannot get probably on YouTube, or you cannot get through articles or any other medium. I think it's having this type of sessions could be extremely valuable for companies to garner attention and visibility on their products and services.
Sure. Now, do you recall the actual topic of the webinar that you attended there, Matteo?
Yeah, the topic was something around selling high value services, essentially. And given that myself, I'm also a professional service company myself, and selling high value services, I wanted to hear from experts on how they have been able to sell multiple millions of their own services, and what their process was and what their sales workflows and playbooks were when they sold those services to their own clients. So for me, that was a very important and very relevant topic, especially now that I'm starting up my company. And so I really wanted to learn more about these people that have actually been in my shoes before me and have walked the path that I'm walking myself today.
Now, do you remember who was hosting this webinar?
Yeah, I do remember. The name of the two hosts, I mean, I can definitely tell you. One is Jesse and the other is Andrew. And those are people that I've been following online for several years on different platforms. And I am subscribed to their email newsletters, and I listen to their podcasts on a regular basis. So I'm very familiar with them, and whenever they, host events like this, if I can attend, if the time zones are not too difficult for me to sort of match up my time zone with theirs, I try my best to attend those events.
Yeah, so the reason I'm grilling you on this, Matteo, is I just think that we should always be thinking about what's worked on us and why, right? And so in these cases where there's someone that you trust, there's someone that's built up trust over time through their podcast, through their videos, things like this, and you follow them, and now they're hosting a webinar, right? And I'm assuming that these individuals make some money, whether they have an agency or they have a coaching business, whatever else, they probably make some money in different ways, right? And I think it's important that they didn't create a webinar that said, why you should buy my services, right? The webinar, it sounds like, was on a specific topic where they're maybe running through some sort of a playbook of how to sell high value services. And if they're doing that, remember, they're kind of indirectly pitching you, right? Because it's their expertise that they're demonstrating, but they're giving you something of value in the webinar. And I think this leads into when we think about how to have an effective webinar. Webinars aren't dead, but guess what? You can certainly have ineffective webinars that either don't get attendees, or webinars that don't get engagement, or webinars that people are upset by because they kind of feel like you put one over on them, or you kind of tricked them into attending your webinar where you're just pitching something. So I think we should really harp on the fact that this was a webinar that came from someone who had built up trust. It came from individuals that were providing real value during that time, and they gave you something to further that relationship. And maybe in the future you'll do business with them. Is that all fair to say, Matteo?
100%. I mean, I knew right away that joining the webinar would eventually mean them, pitching their offering, their coaching services and whatnot. But it's, at the end of it, it's really not a hard sell, because they know very well that at the end of the day, if you've actually gotten value from the sort of the 1.5 hour, which was pretty long, I have to say, of that particular session, if you really want to get into much more depth with the material, I think you make up your mind during the 90-minute session, and not in the 2 minutes at the end where they're actually pitching yourself. So I'm not going to pay for their services at this point, but eventually I could at some point in the future if I think that I'm at a point where I may need to unlock a certain skill that I cannot unlock just by myself. So yeah, definitely.
Right. So one of these lessons is really just to pick something and pick a topic that is highly relevant to your target audience, but it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly what your solution is. Ideally, it's maybe solving a specific problem that you can kind of give people the answer to a specific problem and how you do it, and essentially giving your whole playbook. But then guess what? You have a whole bunch of other playbooks. You have a whole bunch of other offerings. And so I would say that anytime you're really restricting the information that you're providing, that's where, again, I think people can feel not great about attending your webinar. If you're like teasing them and you're saying, here's a little bit of this, and I actually have a template that does that, and I have this and I have that, and I have a way to do that, and then you're essentially saying, and by the way, you can buy my service. I don't think that's going to be very effective. But if you actually say, I'm going to actually help you solve a problem from beginning to end, it's a very specific topic, it's a very specific problem, but I will actually give you all that real information, enough so that you say, oh my gosh, I can't believe that was free. Right? And does that describe what you went through there?
100%. I think I see a lot of companies running webinars in two ways. One is they present evergreen content. And I think evergreen content doesn't go well with the webinar format. The idea of evergreen content is that it's going to be always true, right? But guess what? You're going to find that type of content everywhere else. Everybody has already covered evergreen topics in your industry, most likely. What you really want to try to cover in a webinar are maybe topical facts or topical strategies that are valid today, but were not valid a year ago, maybe. Or maybe it's really something that has been proprietary of your company that you have developed and nobody else has, that you actually have packaged into something that it could be a paid service at some point. And the whole idea of the webinar is basically I think of a webinar almost like you're presenting the whole recipe for baking a cake. But instead of going in depth into each step of how to mix the ingredients and how, everything goes into baking the cake, you're showing them the whole thing. You're showing them the ingredients, you're showing them the steps, but you don't go in such details of each single, step of the process. The point is that you get them curious enough so that if somebody wants to actually avoid the process of actually figuring out how to make all the steps work for them, then they're going to work with you. That's kind of the way I think the most successful companies use webinars nowadays. They give away pretty much the whole secret. They're not keeping a lot of information back, but they're not going to give you every single step of the process.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do think there are two ways to do it, though. It's either that you're going to give them very specifically, like, this is how I ran a campaign that got me this number of leads, and it's showing exactly, like, button by button what I clicked, why I did this, why I did that. And again, it's solving a specific pain and giving them the ingredients and baking the cake with them. I think that can be effective if it's very specific, if it's specific enough. This is how to run this type of email campaign that does this exact thing, and this is how it won business, and this is why I did it this way, and you're following through everything. So again, hyper-specific topic from beginning to end, right? Or I think another way to do it is like you just described, where it's maybe giving the big picture and it's giving how all the things are interlinked and how they work together and why all those things are important, but it's not going as in-depth about each one of them. And I think both honestly can be effective. But the idea is that you're giving them something where it's making them say, oh, aha, oh, I get it now. Oh, wow. Now, to your point, Matteo, that doesn't solve all their problems, because if you're solving one very specific problem and telling them how to bake the cake and showing them how to bake the cake, well, they might want to be a baker, and they might want to know how to do more than just bake one type of cake. They want to know how to cook muffins. They know how to, right? They want to know all these other things. So realistically, you're still just giving them a piece, and they want to go back to you for those other pieces, right? Or alternatively, if you're giving them all the things and you're showing them the big picture, then maybe they actually want the details, and then that's where, again, they want to engage you to figure out how to actually get each of those things done. I think both can be effective personally, but it does depend on the business and the type of solutions that you're offering. Now, I also like the point that you made about the evergreen or non-evergreen nature of webinars, and I totally agree with you too about a webinar isn't like a long-form video that's going to be evergreen and going to be used forever. I personally think that, yeah, a webinar should have a little bit of a shelf life to them. And in fact, when I share a webinar recording, I usually will include the date, and I'll say the XYZ of 2024 or whatever else, because my thought is we're going to have another webinar in 2025 when things change, because I want it to be somewhat relevant to the time. And so I agree that I think we all want to get really efficient and say, oh, well, I want to do this and I want to get the most bang for my buck out of this webinar if I'm going to do it. And so I'm going to make it evergreen so it lasts forever. But I personally have a thought on webinars that I think that you should make them somewhat of a repeatable process, meaning that like the cadence that I like to use is monthly webinars. So a lot of my clients will do a 1 per month webinar, in which case, we don't just want to do a webinar for the sake of it. If there's literally no topics for us to choose, then we won't do it in that month. But I think if we get into a routine as a team to say we're going to do a webinar in the month of, August and then September and October, and we kind of plan out those sort of topics, then we're, by maybe the next year, maybe we actually roll back and we have a similar topic the next year, but times have changed and the situation has changed. But I just want to get into that cadence where the whole team knows how to run a webinar, and we're at least doing a webinar a month. And that the reason why is because webinars can be stressful, right? They can be a little bit stressful. How are we going to get the host? How are we going to get the, a good presentation created? How are we going to deal with the stress of the attendees and all this other stuff and getting engagement? And so if you're doing them at least once a month, by webinar number 5 or 6, you're in a routine, and no matter what the topic's going to be, you're going to be far less stressed. So do you have any opinion on that, of kind of having a schedule ahead of time as a small business and thinking, let's do 1 a quarter, 1 a month? Any thoughts there, Matteo?
Yeah, I would start planning them out sort of as a monthly recurring event, and then see what is the show up rate, how many people that register actually attend it. If the number doesn't seem worth, for the number of attendees, maybe you can try to make it a little bit more exclusive, and rather than having it every month, you can try to have it every 2 months. But in any case, I would still try to keep it somewhat recurring, whether that's monthly or bi-monthly or quarterly. it's like any other type of content effort. I think the real value of these things come in when we do them on a regular basis. And even though webinars are not, I mean, we could use a transcript to potentially get some of that content indexed by the search engines, but generally webinars aren't pieces of content that are going to appear in the search engines on their own. But we can use, and maybe we're going to talk about this a bit later, we can use the content of the webinar to feed into our bigger sort of marketing content engine in different ways. So just having that cadence allows us to really take off a big load in terms of content creation in other areas, because once we have recorded a 30 or 60-minute webinar, we can then repurpose that content pretty much everywhere else.
Yeah, before we go deeply in that direction, I also want to talk about promoting the webinar. So when you mentioned you can start to identify, let's say what the topic is popular by the number of people that are registering, but it's also important not to just promote it to your existing email list. You might want to find other ways to promote your webinar. And so, that might be social media, that might be LinkedIn, depending on, where your potential prospects typically hang out. Is that Facebook? Is that LinkedIn? Is that Instagram? I don't know, right? But you want to push it somewhere. And I want to know if you have any thoughts on maybe how soon or how early you should begin promoting a webinar. So Matteo, do you have any thoughts on if you have an upcoming webinar, should you promote it a month ahead of time, 2 weeks ahead of time, a week ahead of time? What are your thoughts there?
So I don't have a lot of experience with this. I used to run a lot of webinars in the previous company I was working at. And we generally would start promoting the webinar about a month before the event date. And a month seems like a lot of time, but it's actually not that much, because once you start, well, first of all, people will forget eventually. So you want to continue reminding people that the event is coming up. So people that maybe register 30 days prior to the event, of course, you need to have automations in place to actually get people on the live event of the day of the event through your marketing automation tools. But yeah, just starting earlier is, I think, the best way. 30 days, I think, is probably the sweet spot for most companies, just because so that if you see that there's not a lot of early signups to the event, maybe you can start tweaking a little bit. Maybe it's the topic that isn't resonating with people, or maybe the landing page, or it could be different things. But just starting earlier allows you to adjust sort of the messaging maybe a little bit over time. But what is your experience with this, Scott? You seem to have a little bit more experience with this.
Well, no, I think it might depend on the companies. I will say I go a different direction than you do on this, which I think is good, healthy. We can debate it a little bit, but I usually go with a week to a week and a half most ahead of the webinar. And my thought again is that I believe that we need to build up the muscle a little bit in a company to be doing webinars frequently, because not everyone is going to be a hit. So my thought is that if you're doing a webinar every month, then there's less pressure to have that be the one hit webinar, right? Because it's you're just getting into that cadence, and you're testing out different things, you're testing out different topics. And then to your point about people forgetting about it, my fear is that if we're doing a webinar every month and we're promoting it a month ahead of time, then you're still paying. Let's say you're advertising on LinkedIn, you're still paying for those people to come through. And if you have a rate of people registering that completely forget about it or have no interest in it a month later, then you still paid to get those people. And so my thought is a little bit more of a blitz or a sprint, where you're kind of saying, okay, this topic is coming up. We're going to do this webinar next week or in a week and a half. And you're kind of pushing it on your email channels, and you're pushing it on your social channels, and you're doing some advertising on the social channels. And then you're, doing some reminders. And that's where I think you could probably do, the reminder a week ahead of time, a reminder 2 days ahead of time, 3 days ahead of time, 1 day ahead of time. So maybe you're actually going a little bit extreme. You're doing like 4 emails, but I just think that blitz is going to end up getting you a lot more attendees, because they all essentially showed their interest within a week of when the webinar came out. And I'd also say that, we'll touch on this later, but there are other ways to leverage that webinar once it's been completed. So you mentioned potentially posting a transcript on and publishing it on your website. So you might be able to get some SEO benefit from it, though they're going to be a little bit less evergreen than some other things. But the idea is that you can still promote it. And I think you can still essentially get people outside of that 1 week window, because guess what? If you have a recording and you can promote that in other places, then I typically host the webinar and then promote it afterwards, promote the recording, in which case now I'm saying get instant access to this webinar. And the cost to acquire those individuals who are getting instant access to the pre-recorded webinar tend to be lower than the ones that the cost per lead that I get for attending the live webinar. And so I just kind of find that an effective way to say, like I said, sprint, getting as many live registrants as possible. Depending, I mean, some of my recent clients will get 150 registrants, something like that. And we might get between 75 and 100 attendees. Okay. And so then guess what? Those other 100 that didn't attend, or those 150 that didn't attend, now we're promoting the recording to them, right? And hey, they missed it, but now they're still going to at least get the emails and the reminders and the link to the transcription and all this other stuff, right? And then additionally, we're running for maybe another month or even more, we're running people new through our social advertising. We're running them directly to a landing page to then get instant access. And that's been pretty effective for me, but that's just my take on it. All right, so moving into other things that we can do. So we talked about how we can leverage a webinar after we've hosted it, after we've promoted it extensively, whether that be a month ahead of time or maybe my extreme case of a week ahead of time. But I also want to think of other things that make a good webinar. So we talked about how it should be something that is useful. It's a good topic that is highly relevant. It doesn't have to be a direct pitch to your service. My thought is it has to be something somewhat related to your services, right? So if you, I'm going to pretend to be a SaaS provider, but if I was a SaaS provider and I had a software that did a certain thing, but guess what? People that use my software tend to use my software for this certain reason. Well, I can do a whole, webinar on the topic of the reason they use it, and not even necessarily doing a walkthrough of my software as an example, because again, it's related to it. It's getting in front of the right people that might eventually buy my service. So I think it's all back to, is the ICP, is your ideal client profile going to find it helpful and associate with you with that type of topic? And if so, that's okay if it's not exactly the solution you provide as a professional services firm. Are you in agreement with that, Matteo?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think it would be a little bit trickier for certain professional service companies to come up with topics that actually follow this framework. But generally, I agree with you. People are trying to solve a certain problem. If we're talking about SaaS providers, maybe they use your software to allow them to get to solving that problem. But there's a whole process on actually how to leverage that software to the highest extent. And that's where the webinar topic itself comes into play, where you're actually giving them not just best practices, but really your expert insights on how to do a certain thing with your software. Now, without software, if we're talking about services, I think there are professional services that are more conducive to actually having webinars or webinar topics than others. There could be certain companies that maybe are very technical or highly technical, where the topic itself may need the hosts to actually provide some thought leadership. And in that particular case, it could be that your target audience for that webinar are other technical people, and you're really just providing some type of insights that comes from your own personal experience from working in your field. Could be something along those lines. So again, just thinking a little bit in terms of like what type of professional services could be running webinars and what those webinar topics could be like. But do you have any thoughts on this, Scott? Yeah,
well, I think it's a great idea to always be thinking, well, how do you make it interesting? I just think it's important to not be pitching your services directly and not say, oh, I am a tech company, here's my tech solution, let me explain it to you, right? I don't think that's going to get a lot of views, a lot of audience, right? So I think it's important to keep it interesting, keep it where the pains actually are. And yeah, you can go with a partner-led presentation or webinar as well. So you're inviting a guest on who's an expert in a certain area. You can do sort of a joint webinar for where you're splitting up slides, but there is a way to, of course, collaborate with others so that you're kind of sharing audiences a little bit, or you're introducing individuals in your audience to someone who is somewhat related to the services. And I just think collaboration and partnerships are really important in this. You shouldn't just be thinking, me, how do I get a new client today? Just like any of the other marketing efforts that we typically discuss, Matteo, I don't think that all your clients come directly after the webinar. I think they might have attended 2 or 3 of your webinars. They might have really resonated with one where you invited a guest onto the webinar, right? And you're really looking for more touch points with individuals where they're seeing you as an expert, and when they have the need, they're thinking about you. So now, having said that, I've also hosted plenty of webinars, depending on the service, right, that where people actually will right after try to sign up. So it really does depend a little bit on what you're offering, what the price point is that you're offering, and things like this. But I've seen essentially webinars result directly in leads shortly thereafter. And I've also seen cases where it takes some time, but either way, I think webinars can be super valuable if done right. And that leads me into another topic of engagement. So I think that when you first host a webinar, the thought is you're a lecturer in front of a classroom. And there's this feeling of, do I have my lines right? Do I have my script right? And there's this kind of big build up to this one webinar. And I think over time, what you'll start to realize is you don't have to stress out about the webinars as much, right? You're going to learn from each one of them. You're going to learn which topics resonate, but you're also going to learn how to be more comfortable in the moment and a little bit less scripted. And this leads into engagement. I think that the best webinars that I've attended have been ones that are highly engaging with the live audience. So even if you're going to share the webinar recording with people after, I think it's important to have enough attendees that you're having engagement with the live audience. And so, Matteo, I'm curious, have you seen this done effectively, or do you have any ideas on how to get the most out of the live audience so that they're actually engaging and are involved, less so than just listening to a lecture?
Yeah. First of all, I would say a webinar is probably quite the opposite of what we are doing here today, where you and I are just talking to each other. But it could be sort of an introduction to a webinar. Maybe actually the webinars that I've enjoyed the most myself have been the ones where there is a panel discussion at the beginning. So it's generally like a 20 or 30 minute at most, where 2 or more people are riffing off of a topic, and then the second half or 2/3 of the events is a Q&A session. And I think the Q&A is probably the most valuable part of the whole event from the ones that I have attended, that I found more value, because I actually come across, there's a lot of people similar to me that attend the webinars that I attend, and lots of people have questions similar to the ones I have, or actually I can just ask questions myself. So I get to have a direct line of communication with the hosts of the webinar. And I think that's probably the most valuable part, in my opinion, where you're starting to hear what other people's problems are. Lots of people problems are very similar to mine, and that's where lots of good conversations come up, and it becomes much more interactive, and that's where the attention, I think, tends to stay fairly high. Whereas if you have a long hour session, even if you keep it engaging, where people can always raise their hands or leave comments in the chat box, and interact with the hosts, I feel like, I don't know, in my opinion, sometimes I felt that sometimes people tend not to leave too many questions in the comment box. Of course, the hosts need to be aware, if they don't have a dedicated Q&A session at the end, that they need to take breaks so that they can read the questions, answer the questions before moving on to a new section of the event. But yeah, from my experience, I think the best ones are panel discussion at the beginning, Q&A right after.
Sure. And one thing that I think is helpful, it doesn't work for every single webinar, but I do think it's important to get the audience acclimated to how they should actually explain. You need to explain how your audience should be engaging with you at the beginning. So if you're starting out the webinar, you're going to say a little bit about maybe who you are, what to expect from the webinar, if there's going to be a Q&A at the end, and how to interact. And in that early stage, I do find it helpful if you get people to interact with you as soon as possible. And a simple example of that would be, the question of, hey, where are you joining from? Hey, everyone, go into the chat box. It's usually in the upper left-hand corner, whatever else, and you say, go ahead and type in where you're joining from. or what industry you're in or whatever, right? And if you can get them to do something very, very simple, then they're going to get over that hurdle, because most people don't want to be involved. Most people don't want to leave a comment on a YouTube video. Most people don't want to engage, especially in a live event. So can you find a way to make it somewhat silly, somewhat fun, whatever, to get people to do something so simple that at least now they've gotten comfortable with it, right? And that's why I think a lot of people use that whole "where are you joining from?" because that's not a tough question, right? It's a little bit harder to say, what's the biggest pain you're experiencing in your business today? That's a tough one, right? So you might as well lead with something super, super easy at the very beginning. And then you can start to say, okay, great. Oh, I see a lot of people coming from here, right? So you're starting to engage. You're starting to say, hey, oh, wow, someone in San Antonio. Oh, fantastic. Oh, I used to live there, right? Have a little bit of that so they realize they're talking with a real human being who can read their messages and can respond to those messages. And so I think that's a useful tip. And then, yeah, in the Q&A in the end, then it's going to be a little bit easier when you're trying to elicit questions. And to your point, Matteo, I totally agree that sometimes the Q&A can be the most valuable part. And so you should try to budget, maybe 50%, maybe 25%, but some of it should be the Q&A. And as so long as you can get 50 or 100 registrants of your webinar, chances are you'll at least have 2 or 3 people that are going to be somewhat vocal, especially if you warm them up, like I said before, and making sure they're answering questions at the beginning of the session. Any opinions on that, Matteo?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think generally, if there has been enough warm up at the beginning, and just making sure people feel comfortable talking and expressing ideas during the session, I think it's going to be much easier. Actually, maybe this goes beyond what we're going to be talking or later, but I think having this Q&A could be a really good way to actually come up with new webinar topics for future events. The discussions people have during those Q&A sessions are generally very, very interesting. Sometimes they go beyond the topic or the scope of the webinar or the event that they're attending, but those could be good idea generators for future episodes, for future events.
Absolutely. Something I've done in the past with when people are asking questions that are a little too in-depth to cover in the webinar, another way to, again, show that you're a real human being that's engaging with them is you could say, hey, look, I can't answer all these questions, but I'll follow up. We'll share the recording to the webinar, and I'll also share a separate video that are answering some of these common questions, right? And then that's a time for the founder or the host of the webinar to maybe respond back and say, hey, I got a lot of the common questions. I've answered them either here on this blog article or in this video. But the idea being, leverage the webinar as much as possible. Leverage the fact that 50 or 100 people attended your webinar. Don't just say, oh, the webinar is over, that's finished. Make sure you're following up with them after. Was the webinar useful? Is there any additional topics you'd like us to cover? Here's the notes to the webinar and the transcription. I hope you find it valuable. Essentially, do those follow-up actions afterward to make sure that, those are already people that have shown interest, right? Whether it's interest in your company, interest in your services, or interest in the topic. I just think that you should really latch onto that and really just leverage that information as much as possible, as opposed to, like I said, just closing the door and just finishing it. Those are a couple ways I think you can leverage it. And I think, again, emailing the people that even didn't attend and saying, hey, thanks for registering. You might not have made it, but I thought I'd share with you the recording of the webinar, right? That's one thing to do. Getting it transcribed using just a tool like otter.ai or plenty of other transcription tools that are out there so that you can then share the kind of the notes of the webinar at the end of it. And any other thoughts that you have about best practices for webinars or better ways to leverage them that maybe not every business is doing today, Matteo?
I think you've touched on the most important ones. I think one important best practice to follow is not to follow up with a sales pitch. I think that's a no-no. I would say don't use the webinar or the fact that people attended your webinar to qualify them for being pitched later, because people don't want that. I think there's a lot of companies that essentially assume that attending the webinar or registering for a webinar is a signal that they want to buy your service, but that's not actually the case. So I would really recommend not doing that at all. Following up with a summary, following up with the recording and whatnot. I think that's totally fair game. but don't try to now, okay, you've attended a webinar where I taught you how to, bake this cake. Now you have to buy, the baking kit. That doesn't work like that. I would really recommend not doing that. Allow people to make up their own conclusions about what they have learned. And if they want to work with you, then they will reach out to you at some point.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think there are other, again, softer ways to do this. I think that it is okay, in my opinion, to, in a webinar, potentially mention some sort of a discount or promotion that you're running on your services. So if you're closing it and saying, hey, I hope you found this valuable. By the way, if you engage with us in this next month, we're running a promotion where you can do X, Y, and Z. So you're giving them something that is time sensitive, and you're not just saying, buy from me now and pushing a lot of emails afterwards. Instead, you're just kind of like opening the door and say, you're welcome over here if you'd like. I think it is important to give some asks, right? So the ask being, hey, if you'd like to engage with us, you can do this. Basically it's fine to share that you have a service to sell, but to your point, Matteo, you don't need to be pushy about it. The other thing that I like to do when it's relevant is potentially offer additional material that goes outside of, or that is somewhat related to the webinar topic. So for instance, if you're talking about a subject and you have an ebook that's useful, or you have a template that's useful, or anything else, then you could, again, share that link to the live webinar registrants or attendees and say, hey, and by the way, I have this template that goes into more detail of it. You can find it right here on our website. Maybe it's a link where it's not requiring them to enter their email address. Maybe it's one where it is. It depends on the situation. But the idea being, give them essentially, if you're giving them the 101 in the webinar, you might want to give them the 201 in, in some follow-up sort of material that they might find useful. And same thing with the email follow-up. I tend to like to give. There's almost like 3 gives before an ask. And so if you're giving them the webinar and then you're giving them this ebook that's also relevant to the webinar, and then you're giving them some template, then, potentially down the road, I think just saying, hey, and by the way, if you'd like to have a consultation with our team, you're welcome to. I still don't think that's too pushy unless you have an opinion on that, Matteo.
I don't know. I feel like, to me, as a webinar attendee, I just don't want to get sold after the webinar. I think if I'm actually really intrigued by what the company has to offer, I'm totally okay with a soft pitch, maybe a soft ask, and maybe the soft ask could include something along the lines, is it just too early for you to actually engage into this type of conversation? Just give me, an option to not actually commit to this. Don't let me answer with a yes or no answer. Give me three options potentially, because it could just be that it's not the right time for me to, to get on a certain type of engagement. I might be paying for other things. I might not have the budget. I might have the budget later on. There could be a million factors. So I think a soft ask could be okay, but I would just make it maybe a multiple choice answer or something along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. So Matteo, are there any other tips related to webinars that you'd like to share or you think would be useful to professional services firms that are considering a webinar?
Again, I don't have much experience with webinars. I'm actually really curious. Maybe later we can talk more about that offline. But knowing that you got hundreds of participants on a webinar, it's actually really encouraging. When I was running webinars for the company I was working at before, we didn't really get that many. And so what I was about to say was, don't expect to get hundreds or thousands of participants to your webinar, especially if you work, at a regional or local level. But it all depends really, I think, also on the type of service you're offering. It cannot just be generalized to every professional service company. If your type of services are in high demand, you could very well have multiple hundreds of participants. So it really depends. But I would say ultimately just stick to it and, leverage the content you have to then, spread it out across your other channels as well.
Yeah, it's a good point. It totally does depend on the industry. And again, my only point to that would be try to meet your audience where they are. And so so long as you are hitting a topic that they care about, I would prefer, I think you're better off going after a hot topic that you know a lot of people care about, even if it's only 25% overlapped with your product offering or service offering, rather than trying to get something hyper-focused on your service offering and getting 3 attendees, right? And so, because it's really scary, honestly. That's the one thing that's a little bit intimidating, is that if you have a topic that doesn't have a lot of interest, then there's this fear of, oh my gosh, I'm going to have the webinar and no one's going to ask questions because there's so few people that registered. And so I just think you're better off going for the highly in-demand topics as much as possible, making sure you're promoting them ahead of time. Maybe you play it safer by going a couple weeks ahead of time or a month ahead of time, as you suggested, Matteo. But I do think it's important that you do it, right? I think it's important that you learn, because guess what? Your first webinar is not going to be perfect. Your second webinar is not going to be perfect. What I love is, again, getting in the routine of at least once a month doing a webinar, because the 6th or 7th webinar is going to be a lot better than the first one. And I can only tell you that from the clients that I've worked with webinars, they work. They've gotten us plenty of clients. The people that are in the Q&A that are engaging with you are the same ones that likely follow up with you afterwards and say, that was such a great webinar. You're the most knowledgeable on this subject that I ever found. Could we start a conversation? Like, that absolutely can happen. And it's happened. One of my clients that's in an industry that, like you said, it's a little bit more of a topic that's in high demand. But I just think that they can really work. I think it's well worth any company doing, but you have to start, and you have to essentially just get into the routine where they're not a heavy lift, and you're committing to them. Your team is committing to them. You know you're going to be doing one once a month, and you're not going to do 1 or 2 webinars and say, oh, that didn't work, and let me throw up my hands. They still work, but you have to get good at them, right? You have to do them consistently. There's no magic bullet, and depending on your industry especially, you have to work that muscle more and more and more to stand out from everyone else. So I would say almost any industry can benefit from doing a webinar, but you got to start. So with that, I think we can close out the episode, but thank you so much for the time, Matteo. If you liked the content that we covered, please do like, share, subscribe, and please leave a comment or reach out to us if you have any topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes. But we'll leave it there for now. Thanks for joining us on Winning in Professional Services.